Okay, thanks very much, Simon. I had less grey hair in that photo. To be honest, I'm going to level with you. I had actually planned to do a standard presentation on personal data, privacy, but actually the next 30 minutes is going to be more of a rant. And actually it's going to be a rant for a number of reasons. First of all, because I just got back from San Francisco for the RSA conference. And this was a conference of security and privacy professionals. This was, I think they called it the Super Bowl of the security and privacy industry. I actually saw a number of things about the way that our professionals are managing their data, which actually worried me considerably. But equally, we're going to talk about the advent of IoT as well, because I think, you know, one of the things that people don't realize is that all of these wonderful devices that we have in our home are tracking everything that we do and selling that data on to who knows. So when we get started, it always makes me laugh whenever I put this quote up, because everybody here knows this quote. In fact, we know that personal data has economic value. We've known about it for about 15 years, I think. And yet when you go and talk to people outside, they have absolutely no idea that data has economic value. I always ask this question and I say, was anybody surprised at the price that WhatsApp were acquired by Facebook? Everybody remembers how much they were bought for? $19 billion only, by the way. Anybody surprised at that number? One or two? So I actually, soon after they got acquired, I did a news program with CNBC, and you know, they asked me and they said, well, that's a lot of money for a company that really hasn't made a profit. And I said, well, do you really think it's worth that much money? And I said, well, I think it is. Because if you consider it, WhatsApp were acquired for the equivalent of $42 per record. Now, if you reverse, Instagram were acquired for $30 per user, and YouTube were acquired for approximately $20 per user. In other words, what that means is the actual value of personal data is increasing. So our digital footprint is an incredibly valuable commodity, and organizations across the world recognize that commodity. Now, that second point, that consumers and governments are looking for change, is slightly tongue-in-cheek. I have absolutely no idea. Consumers are completely blind and entirely oblivious to this market economy in which their personally identifiable data is making billionaires of people all across the world. They have absolutely no idea. But I think there is a huge opportunity, and that really is, I guess, the purpose of this talk, is for us as an industry to be able to introduce ethical practices. Now, I'm not talking about regulatory compliance. This is not about regulatory compliance. This is about the ethical use of data, giving users the ability to be able to control and have transparency over their data and actually get real market return for their personally identifiable information. That, I think, is the opportunity that we face. So I was going to stand up and I was going to talk to you about a couple of blogs and a couple of stories that I've actually witnessed around this concept of the perceived value of personal data. In order to do that, I was going to share with you a recent story that I wrote in the Telegraph. So of course I went to the Telegraph website and I found the story, and of course, as you can tell, I'm looking to buy a car. I didn't ask for that. I didn't tell the Telegraph, I didn't tell anybody that it's okay for you to keep trying to sell me stuff that I don't need. But there it is. And I think that's a really good example, because I actually provided consent for somebody to be able to track my web history. In fact, all of you provide consent. You provide explicit consent. I mean, if you remember years ago, everybody got upset because the NHS was using the concept of implicit consent. We know what's best for you. And everyone said, wow, how dare a doctor even consider that they know what's best for my medical history. Now I want explicit consent. So now you've got it. Congratulations. It's on about page 27 of the terms of service every time that you sign up for any digital service. At some conferences, I talk about a South Park episode. For those of you that have seen it will know what I'm talking about. We need to move away from this concept that we are actually providing people consent, because we simply aren't as an industry. As a society, we aren't providing people consent. Putting it on page 27, 28 of the Terms of Service and expecting people to read it and understand it is just preposterous. Does everybody remember the company VTech that were recently compromised? Everybody remember this? Now, here was a company who provide electronic toys for children. Now, sadly, they actually got compromised. And all of the information that children had and provided, all of their content, was made accessible to criminals. That's pretty bad, right? So what do you think VTech did? I mean, of course, they did the investigation, they worked with law enforcement, but what do you think their response was? Anybody that has a chance, and actually I tweeted this not so long ago, they edited their privacy policy. And in the privacy policy, they stated, by accepting these terms of service, you accept that your information may be accessed by unauthorized third parties. That's hilarious, right? They wanted to absolve themselves of the liability of protecting your information. And so we had a really long debate, and I would encourage all of you to have this discussion afterwards, because the question becomes, well, under Principle 7 of the Data Protection Act, they can't do that. But they're a global company, so how is that enforceable? If they don't have any assets in the UK, how is that going to be enforceable? In fact, the ICO came out and said, you can't do that, that's unacceptable. But regardless of the fact whether it's legal or compliant or not, I went and gave a talk at a local school, and there were parents there, and I was talking to them about the VTech case. I asked them the question and said, does anybody know, or did anybody buy VTech toys in the last 3 months? And hands went up. And I asked them the question, and I said, well, are you aware of this particular policy change? Are you aware that this is a company that has actually given away information to criminals, information about your children? And not one hand went up. They were completely unaware and entirely oblivious that this is the world that we live in. That they've actually bought equipment in which they've authorized or allowed potential hackers to basically steal information, and they are then held responsible. And they had no idea of this. So if we move forward, I think this concept of oil in the, or what is it, personal data being the new oil, I think in reality what we're seeing is we're seeing two types of business models. And I've actually seen some of that with regards to targeted marketing, but service personalization as well. And generally speaking, I think this market's somewhere in the region of between $50 to $70 billion per annum. I mean, that's roughly what it's worth, which is pretty impressive. But we actually did a study, and we asked consumers, we said, well, what is your perception of personal data? What do you actually want? And they came back with a number of things. First of all, they want control. They want to have a say over who has access to their data. And for me, this kind of comes back down to this concept of consent again. It's not about implicit or explicit consent. To me, it's about informed consent. It's about actually telling me what you're going to do with this and saying, are you okay with this? And me saying, yeah, okay, I am. Or actually, no, I'm not. It reminds me that when I went, we went to go and see Despicable Me 2 at a local cinema. It's a dreadful film, by the way. But my 4-year-old loved it. And we were there, and I think I spent about £30 to go. I think it was 5 tickets. It was 2 adults and 3 children, which is extortionate now, by the way. I just have to say, cinema tickets are just expensive as anything. But at the time, we bought these tickets for about £30, and the teller behind the cash register, she said to me, well, do you want to join our loyalty card program? And I went, do you know what? What do I get if I spend £30? She goes, well, you'll get a free cinema ticket next time you're here. And I said, well, actually, that's probably worth it. I'm happy to trade my personal data for this. And so I said, okay, fine, I'll join your loyalty program. And she said, oh, that's going to be another £15, please. I was like, sorry, you want me to pay you twice, Now, at this point, my wife gets embarrassed because I do this a lot. I'm sure all of you do that as well. You always ask questions. Or actually, when you're at a restaurant and someone takes away your credit card, you're like, no, come back, bring the machine here. I'm that kind of guy. I'm the kind of guy that watches like movies about cybersecurity and says, that's nonsense, that will never happen. And I started to, let's just say, have a debate with this young girl. And I felt really bad for her because I said, well, you want me to pay twice. I said, well, this is ridiculous. I said, I'm paying you with my personal data. And she didn't understand the concept. And I said, well, am I the only person that's ever discussed this with you? That wasn't the word I used. And she said, yeah. She said, we've got about 200,000 customers. And I asked her, I said, well, what are you going to do with this? And she had no idea. And it reminds me of my chocolate story. You know, we were at Westfield and Cadbury's were giving away free cream eggs. And the queue for people handing over their personal data for chocolate was about 50 to 60 people deep. And when I asked them what they're going to do with the data, I walked around the back, there was a privacy policy. It was like tumbleweed and cobwebs. So we're not having this discussion. We're not explaining to people what they're going to do with their data. And I think in part because people aren't asking the question. But that's what we need to start to do, is get people to start asking the question. And then we need transparency on the information that we've provided. Show of hands, how many of you have a smartphone? How many of you have apps on that smartphone? Every one of us. Can you tell me, just one app, what data it collects, where it sends that data, who it shares that data with, who they sell that data with, and how it communicates? Just one app? Can you tell me about all of the apps you have? No. And I'm the same, by the way. This is the privacy industry. And yet you're giving away your information to app providers. You're giving away your information and they're selling it on, and you have no idea who they're selling it on to. Doesn't that worry you? We have no transparency today. And do you think it's going to get any better? We need to start demanding transparency. And not only transparency about what you're doing on my device, but actually what you're going to do with my information. If you get the opportunity, and I'm sure many of you have seen this, have a read up of the WhatsApp investigation by the Canadian Data Protection Authority and the Dutch Data Protection Authority. Have a look at what they said and actually have a look at what they did. And that's just one application done years and years ago. This to me is key, fair value. This to me is how this industry actually becomes a line item in business. Because I genuinely believe that there is real economic value in personally identifiable data. And if you remember, the World Economic Forum cited this economy to be worth €1 trillion by 2020 in Europe alone. Here's the really cool part. 2/3 of that will be realized by the consumer. So we have the ability to be able to allow consumers to be able to get monetary gain from personally identifiable data or their data. I think when they can see the value in that, then they will start to take protective mechanisms in place. Trying to use fear, uncertainty, and doubt to get people to change their behavior doesn't work. Trust, and I like this piece. They said, don't be creepy. And the concept of don't be creepy, we're seeing this all of the time. You know, every time you do a web transaction, every time you're out and about, you get targeted messages, you get people trying to sell you stuff, and I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for someone trying to sell me a Nissan when I was doing research. That to me is creepy. And I remember I gave a presentation and I was on a panel of digital marketing companies. Right, you know what that means. And I said, you're creepy. As an industry, the whole industry so thus far has been relatively creepy. But I think, you know, we can begin to change the dialogue. I love this quote. Everybody remembers Tim Cook from Apple when he changed their privacy policy. It was about last year, and he said, you are not the product. I thought that was fantastic. And I'm really hopeful that organizations will begin to see that personally identifiable data or privacy actually can be a bottom line and actually add value to the business. But if you're getting it for free, and as I tell my kids, they said, Dad, the app is free. And I keep reminding them of this. I'm one of those dads as well. I I took, when my daughter was 4 years old, I started to teach her how to use Metasploit, which was a hacking toolkit, and now actually teaching them how to use Tor. But I think it's important. They need to understand what information is being collected about them. Because that is the world we're moving towards. Now, this actually is a diagram taken from NIST IR 7628, which is the Volume 2 Smart Grid Mandate on privacy. As we move forward, every single device that we have in our home is going to be collecting information about us. How many of you have more than 10 IP connected devices in your home today? Keep your hand up if you have 20, 30. All right, you might beat me. 40? No, all right, so I'm still the most saddest guy in the room. Actually, funny story is whenever I do that, I asked people in the audience once, and somebody said they had 75 devices. And I think the thing that surprised me was he was still married. and I used the word he, by the way, as well. But these types of devices are going to be collecting vast amounts of data in our home. Now, this is just one, by the way. This is taken from a smart meter. And this is what we call, and I don't like to use acronyms, but this is what we call NIAM, which is Non-Intrusive Activity Load Monitoring. Now, every smart meter will be collecting transactional data about what you do in your house. You know, the fact that you've, I don't know, switched the washing machine on, used the toaster, and made a cup of tea 6 times in a day. That's probably in an English house, by the way. Does that worry anyone? Are you happy with this type of data being collected about your home? Are you happy with the fact that the utility knows that you had the hot tub on at 11 o'clock at night? Are you happy with this, anyone? Now, this is interesting because not only can I tell the fact that you're running a washing machine, I can also tell what model number of that washing machine. Now, that's based on what we call a polling interval, so we will ask the meter every 15 minutes. If we decrease that polling interval down to 2 seconds, what do you think we find out then? This might worry you, by the way. You may not want to hear this. What's the saying? Because viewers of a nervous indisposition may want to look away now. Or is it match of the day? They go, if you don't want to know the scores, just go on mute now. Actually, if we decrease the polling interval down to 2 seconds, we can also tell what TV shows you're watching. Absolutely true. By the way, and which country? So there was a country in Europe that had, there was a DSO who had sold smart meters, and there was a vulnerability found, and all of their customers had this particular issue whereby the utility knew what TV shows every single one of their customers were watching. Which country do you think that was from? I hear Germany, right? Because it absolutely was Germany. You know, the bastion of privacy is what I keep getting told. But people didn't know. People had no idea of these implications. But I want to kind of turn this on its head. This is worrying, but this is reality, right? We have to accept that IoT is going to be providing more insights into our home. And if you get the opportunity, have a look at this project called HAT, the Hub of All Things. And this is a university project which is looking to provide that level of insight into every smart home as we move forward. But I believe what we can begin to do is provide informed consent, transparency, and value to consumers. Now, why can't I turn around to the consumer and say, well, listen, you're running that washing machine at 7 o'clock at night. That washing machine isn't particularly efficient. So what we can do is we can provide you with a new washing machine which is more efficient, but in doing so, we can give you a discount of 30 to 40%. And by the way, the return on investment to you is 3 months. We can save energy, you can get economic value, and I believe that's a more ethical way to do things. This, I think, is a move towards this concept of the personal data economy. And you're already beginning to see this, right? The insurance industry, putting black boxes in your car, that's an example of this. And that, in a sense, was what the Department of Business, through the My Data project, tries to do. It tries to provide transparency over what information organizations have about you. So I do think that there is a way forward. It is pragmatic, it is quite worrying, it is quite scary, But if we can provide value to consumers, give them transparency and informed consent, I can say no. I can say, no, actually, I don't want you to know this information, and I don't want you to be able to sell this data on. It's all about value. You know, people will always argue and say, well, I don't use Facebook, or I do use Facebook. But to be fair, they provide you with value. They give you a service. And it's your choice whether you want to use it or not. Now, that, of course, is the great business world. That, of course, is the way that the commercial industry is moving forward. There is an alternate and flip side to this, and I think VTech was an example of that. Ashley Madison was an example of that. We actually conducted research to say, well, okay, organizations are collecting vast amounts of data about all of us. And it seems like every single day there's another organization compromised. So what I wanted to do is just give you an alternate view as well, which is as we're collecting all of this information about you, me, our children, and our family, what happens as a result of that? Well, what happens as a result of that is this information is being targeted by, who knows, nefarious individuals out there. And what they're beginning to do now is they're beginning to sell this information on. So the need to be able to have better degrees of protection, the need to be able to actually understand what's being sold is key. Now, this is taken from a research paper we did called the Hidden Data Economy. And the intent of that was to show people what happens after a data breach. So this one scared me the most. And it's not particularly insightful because we all know personal data is available for sale. But we found this young man, he was 19 years old, based in the east of England. And I remember having this conversation, so we sent it to the police and we said, look, can you let this particular individual know that his personal data is being sold by criminals? So there's a knock at the door and he answers the door and he says, you know, we explained to him what we found. You know, the fact that we've got his demographics, we've got every single one of his digital accounts, his password, his email accounts, even his mum and dad's details, by the way. His mum and dad's Facebook accounts, email accounts, the whole 9 yards. And he asked me a question, he said, well, what can I do? And I said, well, change your passwords, first of all, and don't be so promiscuous when you're on the internet. You know, don't dump all your data out there. And then, of course, the conversation changed because we had other examples where we had medical data which was being sold and stolen, which had been stolen and sold online. And then they asked me that question and said, well, what do I do about my medical data? Any ideas? Because I don't know the answer. And that's the reality of the world that we live in, is that, you know, and I call digital information like a digital tattoo, and I'm sure many of you have heard the concept. You can't tell, but I love tattoos. I'm completely covered, head to toe. And I gave away too much. Damn it. But it's like a tattoo, you know, and I always tell people about this concept that whereby, you know, you try removing your information from the internet, it's like trying to remove a tattoo. You know, it's expensive, it's painful, and it leaves scars. And that's exactly the world that I was trying to explain to this particular individual. And what we're beginning to witness and what we're beginning to see is, you know, I talked about personal data as being the new oil of the digital world. These guys have known it for years, and they've been targeting large databases and large systems to exfiltrate data to be able to go out and sell that on. And it doesn't just end there. You know, personal data is being sold. We've got identities being sold, and even to the point of, if you wanted to be really granular and target people based upon specific profession, you can do that. On the left-hand side, you have a particular seller who's known to us on Alphabet, and he's actually selling information about physicians based in the United States, based on a hospital that he compromised. And that's the world that we live in. And to be honest, this marketplace is getting broader and richer, and even more data is coming online all of the time. Everybody remembers when Target were breached? We saw the information based upon the Target breach, which was 140 million credit card details, online for sale within 2 weeks. It was instantaneous almost. And of course, it doesn't end there, because this was taken actually from a hematology lab based in France. And there was a group of hackers who were trying to blackmail this laboratory to say, unless you pay us a certain amount of ransom, we will dump all of your patient data online. And so the blood results of every single one of their patients was then dumped online. Okay, I'm about done now, actually. I do this not to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And I did warn you that this was pretty much a rant, which it kind of is. But I think there are two key points that we should recognize here. So first of all, we have to recognize that we call it the threat landscape within cybersecurity, but the number of groups out there going out and targeting organizations across the world, stealing information and dumping that data and selling it on is growing at an exponential rate. I wrote a paper called, 3 years ago actually, called Cybercrime Exposed, in which I said, today cyber criminals require no technical knowledge to become cyber criminals. And that's absolutely true. And if I get the opportunity, I can send you the paper. When I talk about this particular research, the talk is entitled, My Dad Could Be a Cyber Criminal. And the funniest thing was, when I spoke at Oxford University, my dad was actually in the front row, and he didn't appreciate that. Too late. It's out. You can't do anything about it. What are you going to do, right? So the first thing we have to recognize is that there is enormous economic value in the data that we have. The actual value of that data is increasing exponentially, pretty much increasing exponentially, although there are some nuances here. You know, the market cost of some of these assets is quite low, but the demand is still high. What I mean by that is 5 years ago, credit cards were being sold at $150 to $130 to $150. Today, they're about $3 a piece. But the demand is there. It's just supply has just completely come in. You know, it's been incredible. But the actual value of personal data is increasing exponentially. The perceived value of personal data, in other words, how consumers value their data, is less than zero. 2 years ago, it was worth a cream egg. Now, if you want to go and watch Despicable Me 2, you've got to pay for the privilege of somebody capturing your personal data. Actually decreasing in value. And that model can't work, and I think that's an issue. But I do think we as an industry have the opportunity to be able to look at things like IoT and allow people the market opportunities to get fair value, the ability to be able to get real transparency and informed consent. And that, to me, goes beyond the concept of using compliance as a driver towards privacy. Because that, to me, just creates a baseline. And you know what? I want more than a baseline. I actually wouldn't mind €1 trillion by 2020. Personally, by the way. I need more tattoos, right? So, you know, my ask of all of you today is, you know, have a look at the research. And if you are interested in some of these new concepts and these new business models, start having this discussion with the business that you're in. You know, in the past, and you know, I've worked in security, information governance, and privacy. I've always been the guy that's been told about projects like a day before it goes live. I remember getting a phone call at 4:30 on a Friday saying we're rolling out a program for 20 million consumers across the country. Can you please approve it? That was on Friday afternoon. And now, by the way, if you try to phone me, I never answer the phone after 4:30. Just a tip. What I'd like to be able to do is move to a world, and actually I was with one of the largest car manufacturers just on Monday, is where we can look to actually provide real value to the business, but do so by providing solutions which I think are ethical and go beyond compliance. With that, thank you very much. Yeah, we've got some time for questions, I think. I'm not answering questions about my tattoos, by the way.
Hi, my name's Kate Mayfield from Mustec. I'm just interested in your views on what the consumers feel about this, because whenever I talk to friends outside the privacy industry, they don't care.
Normal people, right?
Normal people don't care. And I understand how a lab would be blackmailed, and that's bad for that business and indeed for their customers. But I think inside the privacy sector, we worry about it more than our consumer market do.
I think you're right. And to be honest, I think we have the same friends. Because they you know, whenever I talk to people about what I do, they're like, well, oh, I don't really care because the bank will just, you know, if my credit card gets compromised, they'll just give me my money back. But I think there are some things that are going to be changing. So first of all, banks are no longer going to be blanket providing you a refund. And I know of a number of cases in which people have made the same mistake once or twice, and they go back to the bank, and the bank says, well, I'm not going to pay for it. And so I think this comes down to the concept of accountability. And I think accountability is now beginning to be placed upon consumers, which is slowly but surely changing the shift. But we've always tried to educate users by saying, do this, because if you don't, the world is going to fall in, and you know, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse will come, and you know, the worst thing's going to happen. But I protect things that I attribute that has a value. So for example, I lock my car because my car has value. I don't necessarily care about my data because I don't perceive that to have value. And I think if we can begin to have this discussion about economic value that our data has, and actually show examples whereby they can make money through their personally identifiable data, then perhaps we'll start to take it more seriously. Then perhaps we'll begin to try to protect it. But right now, how many people, I mean, if you go and talk to your normal friends and say, what's the value of your personal data? Probably nothing, right? It's like, what's the value of intellectual property? I don't know. There's questions here.
Hi, Stefan from Citi. One quick question on the idea of informed consent. I mean, how do you see that pan out with all the devices, the Internet of Things? How, even if people care, how will they be able to manage that, just in terms of times and capacity?
Yeah, it's going to be hard. It's going to be really difficult. But we've got a couple of pilot projects underway, one particular in smart grids. And the intent of that is to try to introduce informed consent by actually talking, by doing focus groups and explaining to people what we're doing. But I think at scale, it's going to be very, very difficult. But, you know, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink. So I think, you know what? We'll provide the tools, we'll provide communications mechanisms, we'll explain to people what we're trying to do. There will be normal people that will just say, well, I don't care. But at least we can try to provide that information to make it available for people. It reminds me, actually, my brother got an internet-connected doorbell. And he was crowing about this. He said, I've just got this internet-connected doorbell, and you know what? It will text my phone every time somebody's at my house, and I can see pictures of who's at my house. And I went, well, are you aware that this is collecting data about you? Are you concerned about the security and privacy issues? And he went, I don't really care. Now his doorbell rings at 4 o'clock every morning, and now he takes security seriously. But those are examples of, you know, people being feature-driven and not really considering the implications. So what we can do is we can provide the information, we can be ethical, but we can't force people to value their information. That has to be up to them. Oh, it's another one. Okay, that's all we've got time for. No problems. Thanks very much.